James Christie has a wealth of experience and a huge amount of knowledge about IT. He's worked in auditing as an inside auditor, an outside auditor for big corporations, and so he really knows his stuff. We've been lucky enough to get him to come and talk to us about the post office scandal, which is something that we're taking an interest in, and we were wanting to get some expert opinion about how the Horizon software works or in fact doesn't work and what the implications of that might be. Well, James, thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to us. We've been so looking forward to talking to you, and we know we're going to get a lot of interest from the postmasters and postmistresses who've been involved in this terrible case. To start, it would be really helpful if you could tell us about your expertise, your experience, and the way in which you approach your thinking about this problem.
I came into IT by a rather roundabout route. I studied economics and accountancy at university, and I went to work for one of the big four, the big six as it was then, to train as a chartered accountant. And there were all sorts of things that really didn't impress me. I thought and still think that the business model for the external audit profession's broken. And so I switched fairly rapidly to work for a life assurance company in their investment division as an investment analyst. But because of my accounting background and because they had problems, I was sort of moved into the accountancy side, which I didn't really want, but I was fascinated by the IT, by the systems that we were working with. And so I made a complete career switch into IT for a rival insurance company. And I trained there, and I really, really enjoyed it. And because of my background, I got more interesting roles than simple development. And I got asked to move into IT audit after I'd got a few years of solid technical experience. And that really forced me to think about what IT was doing for the company, how it was keeping the company alive, how people were using it, how all the systems fitted together. So I had a good detailed technical grounding, but I also had to think about the big business picture about how computing was working for the corporation. And after a few years doing that, I was headhunted back into development, and then I switched into testing and software testing. And because of my varied experience, I kept on getting interesting offers, and I would always say yes to them. And I moved into information security management for a few years, and then back into testing, which I thought was the most interesting area. So all that mixture meant that I had a very good understanding of technical and business problems from different viewpoints, which is fairly rare because people tend to specialize in one area and struggle to understand other people's points of view. And in the course of this, we were outsourced for our insurance company to work for IBM. And that opened up a whole new world to me because I was sent to work for really interesting clients throughout the UK and also in Finland. And after a few years of that, I decided to go self-employed. I also took a master's degree, which was really interesting in IT, combining my practical experience with some more academic theoretical knowledge. And then I went self-employed. And in recent years, I've been working as a consultant, but in recent years, I've been concentrating more on writing. I really enjoy writing in general, and also about the problems that we have to deal with in IT. And I love explaining what are really quite complex problems and helping people to understand what are the important issues. And I was following the Horizon case from a distance over the years, from articles in Computer Weekly and also in Private Eye. And because of my audit background, I thought this would have been a really interesting place to work, to do a formal IT audit of that system to try and understand what was going on. And when the big Horizon issues case was settled and the judgment came out, I got into it in much more detail, and I was really quite shocked by what I was reading, by the detailed exposition of what had been going wrong. And it became increasingly clear to me that both the post office and Fujitsu had been deeply irresponsible in the way that they'd not so much developed the system, but in the way that they'd been managing it and managing the problems that arose from it. Something that I've learned over the course of my career is that I've got a lot of respect for IT managers, especially the good ones, because it is an incredibly difficult job to do well. It's a difficult job to do at all, but to do it well is almost impossible. And it really, it's managing big modern corporate IT systems. It's not something that you can do perfectly. These systems are always flawed in some respect, and the challenge is to be honest and humble, to recognize the problems that you're dealing with, the inevitability of these problems, and to manage them responsibly. And it became clear to me that what Fujitsu and the post office were doing was they were ignoring that fundamental truth that these systems are always flawed in some respect. And they were maintaining this ludicrous fiction that the system was reliable, entirely reliable and completely accurate for the purposes that they were using it for.
And they were kind of abetted by the legal system, which seemed to have that assumption as well, that computer systems are flawless.
Yes, the assumption under English law is that computer evidence is reliable unless the other party can demonstrate why it is not reliable. And that's an impossible hurdle for anyone to clear in court if they're not the providers of that evidence. I know from experience what a difficult job it is to test software effectively, and also how difficult it is to do a really good audit of an application system. And you need experienced professionals to do that, who've got full access to everything they need. And it's completely impossible for outsiders to come up with the evidence that would be required to prove that system is unreliable when they don't have the expertise and they don't have the access. So the legal system was completely stacked against the sub-postmasters because the law presumed that Horizon was reliable, and the sub-postmasters were denied any opportunity to demonstrate otherwise.
We want to come back to the role of the lawyers and the judges in all that, but it would be very interesting to understand a bit about what it is that a software company should be doing in order to ensure that it's managing its difficulties, its IT properly, just to understand what Fujitsu should have been doing and what they weren't doing, as best you understand it anyway.
Right. When I was working as an information security manager for IBM, it was with newly outsourced accounts. So I was in right at the start when IBM were taking on the service from a big client. And these are big household names. I think I can name them safely because they were entirely responsible, good companies who are doing the job properly, unlike Fujitsu and the post office. The three clients I worked with, I'm sure you'll have heard of all of them. AstraZeneca, Boots, the high street retailers, and Nokia at the time when they were the world leaders with mobile phones, not so much now. But I would be in before the contract kicked in, and my role was to agree all the security requirements to make sure that the service would be tied down tightly to the requirements of the client. And there was a long list of things that we had to agree. And one of these was the control of privileged accesses, how that would be controlled. And that was just one of a long list of things. And it was down, and we went down to the settings for servers. We had to compile an inventory of all the servers that the client had, how they were configured, and how they should be configured in the future to ensure that not only they were secure, but so that we could demonstrate that we were in control if there was a case like Horizon.
And could you just clarify what? Sorry to interrupt you, James. It's, forgive me, but could you just clarify what privileged access means? Because I think in our little software world on record, we call it God, who can do anything. But if you could just explain what privileged access means and why it has to be why it's such an issue.
If you're working on your home laptop, you can do anything to it. When you're working on a laptop that belongs to your employer, you'll be more restricted, but you can do quite a lot. When you're talking about a server or an application system, access is strictly controlled so that people have only the access that they need to do their job. And the high level privilege accesses allow people to go in and change server settings, to reconfigure the platform, to read and amend sensitive data. And that these are actions that should only be taken by certain highly skilled technical people. It shouldn't be available. And the last people who should be able to do it are those who look after the actual application system. There should be a strict segregation of duty between the people that would say understand how Horizon would work and would keep that system running, and the people that would maintain the operating systems and the servers. Because if that segregation of duties breaks down, you start to lose control over the systems and the data. So these high levels of privilege are potentially very dangerous, and they've got to be tightly controlled and monitored. And this is when I was working as an IT auditor, that was one of the basics. If we went into audit and installation, that would be one of the first things that we'd be checking for, because if these privileged accesses are not tightly controlled, you can be fairly sure that there's an awful lot else that is not tightly controlled. The analogy I used in one of my blogs, remember, was it's a bit like an ordinary auditor coming into a company and finding that the petty cash fund is sitting in a bucket at reception with a lot of blank signed checks, so that anybody can jump in and grab some money just to keep the thing going. And that's how Fujitsu were working with Horizon. People had very high levels of privilege so that they could jump in and fix the data when that was required. Where what I would have expected as an auditor and a security manager is that there would be a specific process for doing that, and people would, the change would either be set up as a production job, controlled production job, rather by somebody just going in and editing the data, or it would be the appropriate privilege would be granted to somebody, they would do it, and then that privilege would be removed from them. And then there would be a check to see that the right thing had been done, and only that thing. The idea that, the idea that there would be no effective controls that's unacceptable.
So how many?
And this was something.
Sorry, Jane. How many levels of access would there be, do you think, in a kind of a system of this size? Could you have kind of 10 or 20 or 100, or what's it likely to be?
Levels of access? No, it would be into the low double figures, I'd have thought.
So a lot of different people would have a lot of different ways in which
some would have some privileges, the whole time, and there's some privileges that would only be allocated on a strict as required basis. What is clear from what came out in court is that these were not being managed properly. It was my job with IBM to ensure that these things were tied down and agreed right at the start. And one of the cases in the companies I mentioned, it had to be done before this contract actually started. Everything had to be agreed. In the other cases, it had to be sorted out within the first few months. And if it was not done within the first 6 months or so, I would have been in trouble. That would have been a serious failing on my part. Fujitsu took over the outsourcing contract with the Post Office in 1996. And in 2011, the external auditors, Ernst & Young, flagged up in their management letter that these high privilege levels were not being effectively managed. There was a long list of things in that management letter that had not been done, that really should have been done 15 years previously. Yeah. And having worked as an internal auditor, I know that it should be extremely embarrassing if the external auditors find problems that the internal auditors have not discovered and addressed, because the internal auditors are there the whole time. They know the business. They should have the time and the expertise to make sure that these problems are addressed. The external auditors are there to audit the financial statements, to assess whether they provide a true and fair view. So they're only required to comment on problems that affect the financial accounts. And they're operating at a much higher level than the internal auditors should be. If they discover a problem that the internal auditors have missed, that suggests the internal auditors were not up to the job.
So James, if you had come into a company like Fujitsu and found that, as an external auditor, and found that they hadn't been managing their system in this kind of way, would you have assumed that this would be endemic through the whole company, or would you just think, oh, well, this is just one team not doing a good job? I mean, how would you regard a company like that where you found this kind of problem?
I'd have thought that was evidence of an overall lack of managerial control.
Yeah.
However,
well, you don't know, of course, from this distance, but
no, but I'd be skeptical about the quality of management. But external auditors, as I say, they're looking at a different. Their perspective is different from the internal auditors, and the external audit profession they've got their own problems, and one of them is that they're not inclined to rock the boat unnecessarily. They don't really want to kick the people that are giving them their big fees.
No,
of course.
So there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. And if they're pointing out problems, like as Ernst & Young were, that should be so embarrassing to the Post Office, it's an indication that it's something that's fairly serious and that no external auditor could overlook once they knew about it.
And am I right to understand that Fujitsu still manages the Post Office's computer system?
Yes.
In spite of everything that's happened?
Well, yeah, yes, in spite of that, but there's talk in the press, and I've picked up on it too, under the radar, that the Post Office is starting to pull services back from Fujitsu, and it's possible that the current contract is going to give them the chance to unwind.
But this is 2021, and that was 1996 that we're talking about.
It will be a big exercise to bring it back. From what I hear, there's a different culture within computing at the Post Office now, and there's a lot of new people in who would not defend what was done in the past. I know somebody well who works there, and this person is extremely competent. It's exactly the sort of person who should be in there in a senior role. And so I find it reassuring to know that that person's there. But I say it was 15 years after the start of the service, before Ernst & Young flagged up this problem. And it became clear that by 2015, 4 years later, it had not been properly addressed, and that the only control over these high-level privileges was that people were logging on with them and then logging off without any record of what they'd done. And it's 19 years, I mean,
So you were
that's
reduced
longer
to
than some people's
speechlessness.
IT careers.
But then the Post Office Limited had an obligation to ensure that their software was being managed properly. Presumably, it's not just Fujitsu who had a responsibility, but the Post Office
Exactly,
also.
yes.
So what should the
and
Post
one of the-
Office have been doing?
Yeah, well, in my experience, having been outsourced and working with outsourcing, clients who are outsourcing their computing, it's quite a big deal at the start because the outsourcer, IBM, they want the best people to come over. They want to grab all the good people they can get because they can then send them off to work for other companies too. The client needs to keep a core of good people who understand the service and can monitor it from their side. And so they want some of the same people. But the client has to keep good people who will be able to keep on top of the contract, the service that's been provided, to monitor what's been provided, to ensure that the systems are being changed responsibly and changed to do what the client requires in the future. And who are capable of managing their supplier toughly when it has to be done, but responsibly. You get some goons who think it's fun to give the supplier a kicking. That's not particularly constructive. And you get some people who are more inclined to pass the buck and let the supplier do what they like. That was not my experience. The latter, I didn't see much of that in my experience. But that's clearly what was going on with the Post Office. They were not managing Fujitsu as toughly as they should have been.
And of course, at the top of these companies, you've often got people who are, in their 50s or 60s and who aren't IT literate, who are having to rely on their internal IT department to keep them informed. So
Yes.
There's presumably some interface between the management and the IT department within a company, which has to, again, monitor that the IT department's functioning properly.
Yes, indeed. And that's not just the case with an outsourcing contract. When I worked as an IT auditor for that big insurance company, I was used informally by the UK chief accountant as his IT consultant, because I was outside information services, quite independent from them as an auditor. And so he would bounce ideas off me and what was proposed by the IT people, and I would reassure him that what he was being told and offered was reasonable and responsible. So I was able to provide that independent source of advice. Information services were quite happy with me doing that because it gave what they were saying more credibility. If somebody who was independent was able to tell senior management that what they were saying was reasonable. But it's a very important role to have people who are capable of working at the interface between the technical people who can, sometimes their interpersonal skills aren't great and they can slip into gibberish and jargon. And you need people who can interpret that and communicate in business terms to the senior management who are capable of bridging that gap. And if you haven't got that, it's just going to lead to confusion and problems. The IT people will feel that they're not understood, that they're not getting effective support and guidance from the user, from the business community. And the business community are liable to feel that the technical people are a bit arrogant and out of touch and don't understand the business.
Right.
It's a really important role, these people that can work in between, ensuring that everything sort of the show keeps going more or less without too many punch-ups.
Yes, because I mean, again, our tiny experience of the IT world has been that as a lay person, if we call the rest of us lay people, really, it's very difficult to know what's going on in IT, and you don't know what you're paying for very often, whether people are playing ping pong all day and doing 10 minutes work at the end of the week, or whether they're grinding away steadily for 50 hours and putting in a huge amount of sweat.
Because developer, a computer programmer who's thinking through a really deep problem will look completely indistinguishable from somebody who's daydreaming about the weekend's football. They'll just be sitting back like this. And that doesn't really inspire, senior business managers are wandering through the IT department. If somebody's typing away at a keyboard, they must be working.
Yeah.
If they're sitting back with their eyes glazed, who knows?
And this is where it's reasonable to sympathize with the difficulties of managing IT, as you said at the beginning, that it's not easy, but people need to acknowledge that.
And yes, you've got to acknowledge that, you've got to accept it, and accept that there will be problems, and the challenge is to manage the problems rather than to try and persuade people that the problems don't exist.
Yes.
And that's where I think IT auditors have a very important role, because, well, software testers, they're part of the IT community, they're part of that hierarchy. The auditors are quite independent. Their reporting line is to the non-executives on the board, or it should be. And it was in the case of the post office, which means that if I see that you're doing something wrong and I call you out on it and you refuse, and I push the point, even if you outrank me theoretically, you cannot pull rank on me. You cannot threaten me. You can try it. But my response would simply be to smile sweetly and walk off and tell my manager, who would then escalate the matter. And there's no reporting way in the reporting line that you could pull rank on me. You'd have to go to board level, to the non-executives, and it's not going to happen.
No.
In my experience, people would often try to intimidate and undermine the IT auditors, and it's just water off a duck's back. You just ignore it and keep going. Yeah, I've seen some fairly loud and angry confrontations with people trying to intimidate senior auditors, and it just doesn't work.
But there's a difference between auditing and what Second Sight were doing with the post office problem. Is that right? Because they weren't able to penetrate the problems that, or at least they found it very difficult, apparently, to penetrate the difficulties that were going on.
What they were, the forensic exercise they were doing seems to have been very similar to what we would do in a really detailed technical system audit. However, we had full power. We had the same rights that the post office and town auditors had. They had, and I'm quoting, they had unfettered access to data, systems, and staff. Unfettered access. And now, if you interpret that the way that we did, and the way that they should have done, that means basically that you could press gang somebody and insist that they come and speak to you. You could insist on access to any documentation, because if people are withholding documentation that you feel you need for an investigation or an audit, you cannot do your job. And that is something that we would not have accepted it. As a matter of principle, if somebody refused to provide us with documentation, we'd have escalated and kept going. Now, Second Sight were external contractors. They did not have that power. And it seemed fairly clear that they were sacked once they pushed too far and started to push into areas that were going to be embarrassing for the post office. And this is one of the failings of post offices internal audit. They should, it was understandable that external consultants should come in to do that, do the investigation that Second Sight did, because there was a lot of publicity by that time, and it's quite understandable that if the post office felt that this needed somebody who is independent, if the post office had good IT auditors and enough of them, they would have been able to do, in theory, have been able to do that job, but there would have been that practical problem of the optics would have looked independent to outsiders. So I think that the post office internal auditors should have been in the background, ensuring that they were kept up to date with everything Second Sight was doing, and also ensuring that Second Sight had the access that audit would have had, and that Second Sight did need, and should have insisted that if Second Sight were stonewalled or blanked, audit should have stepped in and said, we'll take that, we'll have that documentation, we'll have that access, and we'll pass it over to Second Sight. Yeah. And when Second Sight were sacked, they were asked to hand over all their working papers and documentation. And again, internal audit should have seized that to make sure that it wasn't destroyed.
I was going to say there was evidence of shredding, or perhaps it wasn't shredding, but destruction of documents, wasn't there, James?
Yes.
And what would your impression, if you've been involved in doing an audit, if you were working in a situation where you were hearing that stuff was being destroyed, what would you do?
I'd want to see evidence that it wasn't being. I'd ask for the stuff that was allegedly destroyed to see whether or not it had been, and to retain our own secure copies, just in case, for the future. And if that wasn't available, without even, I'd go straight back, and without even sitting down at my desk, I'd be onto the IT manager, and he'd be onto the group chief auditor, and within hours, that would have been escalated. Auditors live and die by evidence. They need to see evidence that the service is controlled, that evidence that shows who was doing what. If evidence is destroyed, then the auditors cannot do their job effectively. And if they can't do their job effectively, that's a matter for serious escalation. It's the destruction of evidence in the way that we now know the post office is doing. That would be incredibly serious, even if was not evidence that was required in a court case. When you add that in too, it was clearly potentially criminal, as well as being deeply unprofessional and irresponsible. And that should have been perfectly clear to internal audit, because at the time that this was, the shredding of documents was being done at the post office, this was many years after the prosecution started. This is while people were still in jail for offences where the only evidence was from the flawed Horizon system. So, the post office were warned by one of their lawyers that this could amount to a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and that clearly was the case.
I don't know whether this is a question that you could answer, James, but how, thinking of each individual postmasters or postmistresses' cases, how much time, it's probably a difficult question, but how easy would it be to find the evidence to show that clearly they should never have been prosecuted? Or is it impossible to say you could even find that?
I suppose we're talking about like expert input to their cases to assist their defence. Could somebody have intervened helpfully?
I think so, because it was clear that there was a lack of effective management control, which would have, if it wasn't for this, the problem that computer evidence seemed to be reliable, that was a real barrier. If it hadn't been for that, and it was simply a matter of the prosecution having to prove that a fraud had been committed beyond reasonable doubt, it would have been quite easy to have cast serious doubt on the reliability of the evidence by pointing to the problems with the system, the problems that should have been, that we now know existed, by pointing to the lack of effective management control, which meant that they couldn't have confidence in the integrity of the data. So if it hadn't been for that barrier imposed by the presumption of reliability, then defense lawyers who'd been well briefed and who had access to the relevant disclosure from the post office, they should have been able to cast doubt about cast doubt on the prosecution evidence, and to show that there was a very weak case against the sub-postmasters without having to delve into deep technical detail about specific problems. Because there is something that really disturbs me, is this serious inconsistency between the presumption of computer reliability, the presumption of innocence, and the requirement for the prosecution to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. The existence of this presumption that computer evidence is reliable seems in effect to flip the presumption of innocence around and require the accused to prove their innocence. And it also seems to mean in effect that the case to the prosecution doesn't have to be proved beyond reasonable doubt.
Yes.
I find it difficult to understand how that presumption has lasted so long on any grounds other than convenience for the justice system.
But there is an issue about what is a bug, isn't there? I mean, what is
yes.
what counts as a bug? Because clearly there were bugs in the system, as there would be in any highly complex system, which people were pretending didn't exist. But some issues were kind of in your face. There were kind of obvious problems with the software, to do with whether people even understood what, how it functioned. The users understood how it functioned.
I mean, this was there's a lot of argument in the Horizon Issues case about what a bug was. The post office were trying to insist that a bug was simply a software error, a software coding error, and that's far too narrow a definition. Because bugs can arise from all sorts of things, from unexpected data, from hardware problems, from the interface design so that users are misled or confused and make avoidable errors, from the interfaces between different systems, and also with a large complex system, something that's a bit difficult for people to grasp, but people who've worked in this field understand the behavior of all the components doesn't explain the behavior of the whole system. The components of a complex system can combine in ways that are unpredictable. And all the components can be working perfectly as designed, coded perfectly according to specification. And the overall system might do something disastrous, literally. I mean, this is something that's recognized in safety critical systems and aviation systems. They know that planes can crash with all the components software working perfectly. And likewise, on the other hand, you can have lots of problems within the components, but the system can keep going. People manage these problems. They're not allowed to develop to the point that they're visible and they cause problems for the business.
Well, if I could just try and give you were saying in aviation, and in fact that disaster with the aircraft that kept crashing for Boeing is an exact example of that, isn't it? Because the systems were working, it's just the pilots didn't know how to correct the automatic dive that their planes went into as their way of correcting a stalling problem, and so it was all working properly, but that killed hundreds of people.
Yes.
So I suppose that's how it works in the aviation system.
Yeah, safety critical people working with aviation systems. I really like their attitude because they tell it like it is. They're very clear-sighted, because often in conventional IT, people can get by with a bit of bluff and bullshit and skate over problems. The people working with aviation systems know that if they do that, people die in large numbers. They cannot do it. They know that. So they're the grown-ups. And I think that we should maybe learn from them. But the arguments about what are bugs, this was Mr. Justice Fraser rejected the Post Office's case. He said that bugs can arise from all sorts of things, and they must not be, the definition must not be restricted to software errors. And there was a particular, there was a part of the case that really caught my eye, where the sub-postmaster's expert witness was talking about phantom transactions, and the Post Office Council took him apart, arguing fairly successfully that these so-called phantom transactions were actually a design quirk, the system working as it was designed. And what happened was that if a sub-postmaster suspended a transaction in the middle and then did not return to cancel it or commit it, the system would automatically commit it and record a transaction as having taken place, when in reality, in the post office, nothing had happened. There'd been no completed transaction, and that could leave the sub-postmaster or mistress financially exposed if the system had recorded that they'd sold something and there was no money in the till. And the Post Office's case was that was the system working as designed, and the expert witness for the sub-postmasters didn't accept that, but he was left rather dangling in the wind by this very skilled barrister for the Post Office. And he was so glib and persuasive that Nick Wallace, the journalist who has been so fantastic throughout this whole story, in his account in the blog, seemed to be persuaded that the Post Office Council was right, that it wasn't a bug, and that the sub-postmaster's expert witness had been rather humiliated. Now, I put this out hypothetically on a Twitter poll yesterday, and I got 126 responses. And the options were, if this happened to you, if you found a problem that would confuse users and lead them to, and cause a loss, and the developers and the project managers refused to accept it as a bug and said, no, that's a system working as designed, it's not a bug, what would you do? And the options were, agree that it's not a bug, check with the users, escalate outside testing, someone more senior, or other. And I got 126 responses, and only 4 people said that they would accept that it wasn't a bug. And the others, it was a mix of, they'd escalate it to people like senior management or audit. They'd go and speak to the user community to try and get some support from them, or the other was largely keep going and trying to keep the discussion going about the implications and how damaging it might be. But it was interesting that only 4 out of 126 thought it was acceptable to say it wasn't a bug. And from the audit point of view, if in that case, people have to be held accountable for what they're doing. And if the system automatically commits a transaction without the explicit approval of the user, you don't have any meaningful authorization for that transaction. It's just an arbitrary act by the system. But the Post Office's attitude, in effect, would be, no, the sub-postmaster is accountable for that because they should not have left it in a suspended state. even if they didn't know that the system default would be to commit it. And it was quite interesting seeing some of the responses. There was a lot of strongly worded responses. And I was quite impressed by one of my German testing contacts. And it was a tribute to the German education system. His command of colloquial English is very impressive. I won't repeat what he said.
So you have a...
When I read that, I said, have you ever considered the career IT audit? Because he sounded like a really aggressive auditor. Telling the developers and project managers that, no, this is a bug and what you're saying is completely unacceptable. Using 4-letter words.
I just wanted to comment that the postmasters and postmistresses were faced with a combination, weren't they, of a level of ignorance amongst both the judiciary and the other lawyers, both prosecution and defence, but also some determination to push through a viewpoint which some people quite clearly knew was unreasonable. I mean, that in those court cases, people were defending a position which I would have thought anybody would realise was a false one. You know, in other words, for example, that computers software doesn't make errors, or computers in complex systems.
Mr. Justice Fraser, he commented without expanding on it, that at one point he thought the Post Office Council were saying things they'd been instructed to say by the Post Office that they didn't actually believe, going by the lack of detected a lack of enthusiasm in pushing the point.
Right.
But there was, in the Horizon Issue case, there was something that really did catch my eye, and that was the arguments about the error logs, the KELs, as they're always referred to, the known error logs. And the Post Office resisted disclosing these. First of all, they said they took 3 lines and all of them were shot down by Mr. Justice Fraser. The first line was, they don't exist. Now, that would be a staggering assertion. First of all, I would not believe that. And secondly, it just seems amazing that in a court case that was about the credibility and the integrity of a system, you had the owner of that system saying, no, we don't keep a record of errors.
It's amazing, isn't it?
And if that were true, that would be an admission that they had no effective control over the system, and the case could have stopped then, as far as many IT people would be concerned, because it would have been the Post Office admitting that they were not managing the system. Therefore, nobody could sensibly rely on that system and the evidence that came from it. And the second line of argument from the Post Office was, well, okay, these logs do exist, but they're irrelevant. And again, that just takes you back to the previous argument. If you think they're irrelevant, then that says nothing good about your ability to manage the system. You need these logs about the errors to know what's happening with your system so that you can manage it. And the third line was, well, even if they're relevant, we can't do anything about them because they're not our logs, they're Fujitsu's. And again, if that's the case, if the Post Office don't have ready access to these logs, and we know that they didn't actually because they had to pay for information about errors on top of the normal contract charge, then that's an admission that they were not in a position to manage the service effectively.
Is that a usual term of a contract, or would that be very unusual for people to actually agree to, that you're not entitled to unless you pay?
And I would have always expected that to be readily available, because
yes,
the system owner needs to know about these problems. And if the contract was written in such a way that that information was not readily available, that is evidence of a problem in itself. And I would have expected the IT auditors to have objected to a contract being written on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have been extremely unhappy about that. I mean, how can you manage the service if you don't have access to all the information about its problems? Because it would have to be the post office that would dictate the priority for fixing these.
Yes,
and
of course,
if it can't
it's their
do
service.
that, if it doesn't have information about all the problems, how can it actually say what needs to be fixed most urgently and what can we live with?
What's so astonishing is that the comments you make are so transparently obvious, and yet we have a situation which persisted for years with intelligent, educated people in the court system kind of overlooking it all and seeing it completely differently. It's a most extraordinary situation.
Yeah, and it really doesn't reflect well on anyone. There's the project at Exeter University that's looking into the implications for the legal profession, and that's going to be quite interesting because clearly there are problems for the legal profession. I think many lawyers their concern was only about winning and how they did it and the implications of whether or not the outcome was just. It seems to have been irrelevant. And it's almost as if for some people, the end justified the means and the end was winning. And so you had a failure to disclose all the relevant information and this constant pretense that information that was clearly relevant wasn't relevant or wasn't available.
Well, we're in touch with Rebecca Helm, and we're very much hoping to speak to people from that team to hear more about that legal aspect.
Yes, I shouldn't say too much about the lawyers because I'm not a lawyer, but what I can say is my bewilderment.
Yes.
As somebody with experience of big, complex corporate IT systems, that the law couldn't cope. Couldn't cope with the reality and maintain this fiction that the systems were reliable.
Yeah.
And most systems are reliable in the sense that they will do the job pretty much for which they're designed. But that's only because you've got good people beavering away in the background, keeping the show on the road, dealing with the problems, investigating them and resolving them before they hurt people.
Yes, quite.
Whereas the post office's assumption was if there was a discrepancy, that was evidence of a crime.
So
if they had simply parked these things for investigation without taking punitive action against the sub-postmasters and mistresses, it's quite likely that we'd never have heard about Horizon. The post office in Fujitsu would just have been muddling along, in a state of confusion at times maybe, but nobody getting seriously hurt by these problems. The deeper problem was one of corporate governance and a really appalling culture at the post office, which meant that these technical problems escalated into catastrophic, tragic human problems. And I find that unforgivable because it was the job of people like the IT auditors, the corporate governance professionals, to make sure that you didn't get that crossover between irritating back office technical problems crossing over to people's lives being ruined.
Horizon Helpline was there for a purpose, you would have hoped. I mean, a lot of these postmasters and mistresses are saying I was phoning them daily. I was saying what was going on. I was saying this can't be right. I was saying I want you to put something, to look into this and to sort it out for me. And it just didn't happen. They didn't have that support, did they?
And the people who turned up, and we talk about auditors in this conversation, the people who turned up at the post offices to interrogate the postmasters and mistresses presented themselves as auditors.
Yes,
And
they
it seems
did.
that very often they weren't actually auditors at all. They were
just
actually
the investigators.
investigators who were often ex-policemen, and they just pretended to be auditors. The whole word auditor is kind of taken on a new meaning in the post office scandal.
Yeah, auditors should be checking what they're seeing, checking the validity, the accuracy of what they're seeing against some separate oracle to satisfy themselves. This idea of vouching, and it's what auditors do all the time. But the so-called branch auditors at the post office were simply assuming the accuracy of their Horizon system. Any deviation from that was evidence of a serious problem, a crime. When I worked as an insurance auditor, the IT auditors would audit the systems for processing integrity. As all the processing complete, authorized, accurate, and done on time. And we would then form a view that, well, some things might need to be tweaked and improved, but then basically the system we'd say was sound. Then the branch auditors, but they would be using that advice, that assessment, when they were going out performing their audits at the company's branches. What was the basis for the post office auditors' belief that Horizon was sound? It was mere assertion by management that it was reliable, and that's not good enough.
No.
You need evidence to show that the system is reliable, and it's up to auditors to discover that, to uncover it.